Okay, hello again everybody, and welcome to the second of the three different sections of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s material. I hope you're all doing really well. I hope you let me know if you've got any questions that I can help with. And I guess jumping into it, in our last session, we looked at some of the changes happening in the American sort of economy, society, politics in the post-war years into the 1950s, and then made our way up into Kennedy's administration. He is elected in 1960. He's assassinated in November of 1963. And Kennedy has certainly sort of a mixed record when it comes to his administration. Certainly significant culturally, symbolically, but in terms of actual legislative achievement, not necessarily one of the great presidents in some respects. His successor, a man named Lyndon Johnson, is going to inherit a big chunk of Kennedy's policies, his agenda, and in other respects, Johnson is going to advance his own agenda as president. Johnson is certainly one of the titanic presidents in American history. Like it or not, he's responsible for advancing the sort of social services, welfare state, as some people call it. Over the last 50, 60 years, it has been one of those political hot points that still manage to polarize people on either side of the political divide. And a lot of that certainly got started with Franklin Roosevelt, but Johnson is the person that really ends up helping to sort of solidify that in American politics and in the American conversation. So Johnson's administration is really a complicated one. He has a lot of things going on during his presidency. He finishes out Kennedy's remaining few years, well, about 14 months, 16 months worth of Kennedy's term, and then Johnson is elected on his own in 1964. So Johnson, who is he? What does he do? How does he fit into all of this? His victory in 1964 is a landslide. He's going up against a Republican senator from Arizona named Barry Goldwater, and Johnson he's not exactly riding Kennedy's coattails, but he is certainly advocating a very different kind of approach to American foreign policy in particular, but also sort of the American agenda as a whole. The problem, though, with Johnson is he is sort of split between, on the one hand, his really legitimate desire to develop programs in which the government will provide assistance and resources and opportunities for people, especially in the lower classes, whether they are minority populations per se or not. Things that are known as the Great Society. Mentioned a little bit of that in the end of the last recording, whether it's Head Start or Medicare or the Job Corps or that kind of thing. But Johnson's problem is he also pretty much simultaneously decides that he's going to dramatically escalate the situation in Vietnam. And this is going to mean that he is caught between these two opposite ideals, one of which being fighting communism, preventing the fall of South Vietnam to the communist north, versus the ideal of improvements at home, right? Improvements in the United States. Johnson is given basically a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. It's not an official declaration of war, but it provides virtually the same unlimited ability to fight a war in Vietnam. This is known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Long story short, there are American ships patrolling the coast of North Vietnam. On a few nights in August of 1964, they assume let's say that they are under attack. There's not a lot of hard and fast evidence that there was an attack, but be that as it may, they send word back to the United States indicating that there was this attack by North Vietnamese patrol boats on the American warships. Congress then grants President Johnson virtually a blank check to wage war in Vietnam. And this is going to then sort of launch the United States into this 8-year-long conflict where nearly 60,000 Americans die. So how does all of this play out? Well, initially there are fairly significant troop deployments in South Vietnam, but a lot of the initial action is sort of begun with bombing campaigns. There are a number of different bombing campaigns throughout the Vietnam War. The first major one is known as Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder ends up putting the United States on the path to even more involvement on the ground. These campaigns end up killing thousands and thousands of people, leaving millions of them homeless and turning them into refugees. And as I said, they kind of spark the expansion of the sort of infantry presence, the ground presence by American forces in Vietnam, so that for the sort of majority of Johnson's administration, there is this continual escalation of numbers of American soldiers and airmen and Marines in Vietnam, from 23,000 in 1964, when Johnson really sort of begins his presidency in earnest, to more than 530,000 by 1968, which is in many ways the peak of America's involvement. The United States is confronted with a very tricky situation in Vietnam, and that is, there is certainly the army of the North Vietnamese state, right? This is known as the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. They are an official, formal military force, just like the United States Army. This is one of the opponents that the Americans have to face. There is also then the sort of guerrilla force, right? These are known as the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are sort of nameless, faceless, could be anybody in a crowd, operating in guerrilla tactics, sort of attack and retreat kinds of things. The United States then decides to use a tactic or a strategy known as search and destroy. Ultimately, they're waging a war of attrition. And what is a war of attrition? Well, a war of attrition basically means to kill as many of the opponent as is necessary in order to break their will to fight. So it's not necessarily a matter of advancing systematically towards a particular objective and taking that objective, and once that is done, then, the enemy surrenders. So this isn't the same as, say, the European theater of World War II, right? You march towards Berlin. When you take Berlin, essentially that is going to be the end of the war in Europe. That's never attempted, really, in Vietnam. Certainly North Vietnam is bombed heavily, including the capital of North Vietnam, Hanoi, is bombed heavily. But by and large, the strategy that the United States pursues is to reach out to pockets of enemy combatants, whether it's the NVA or the Viet Cong, reach out to pockets of these combatants, often by helicopter, land a few hundred American soldiers or Marines, kill as many of the enemy as possible, and then leave. This makes for a very, very difficult war, especially in terms of explaining measurable success to the people at home. So really the only thing that the American military can provide as evidence of success is body counts. So how many people did we kill today? How many people have we killed this week, this month, this year? And that then is presented as evidence of success. This contributes then to a sense among the American people that the war is not exactly winnable, that it is not exactly being carried out in an effective way. And so this results in a fairly widespread anti-war movement, oftentimes centered in the college population. And much of that is kind of congealed around a group known as Students for a Democratic Society, or the SDS. The SDS is created in Michigan in 1960, but it really kicks off in earnest in sort of the early 1960s, and then as America's involvement in the Vietnam War increases, the SDS becomes more and more active in kind of leading the student effort in resistance of the war, whether it's demonstrations, whether it is sort of sit-ins, whether it is draft resistance, any number of things. There's also then a similar kind of an effort that takes place at the University of California, Berkeley, known as the Free Speech Movement, which expands this question of anti-war resistance into the direction of what's being perceived as censorship, sort of the repression or the limitation on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that is sort of perceived among college campuses around the country. So certainly the free speech movement is centered in Berkeley, but you see sort of offshoots of it that appear at other campuses and other universities, places like Columbia University in New York, for instance. By the mid to later part of the 1960s, anti-war demonstrations start to move into a little bit more sort of active phase, right? So instead of just protesting and demonstrating, you start to see a little bit more confrontational kinds of actions on the part of anti-war protesters in trying to get their message across, but then also in some cases in trying to limit the ability for military recruiters or draft enforcement, trying to limit their ability to achieve those kinds of goals. And partly this is because the way the draft is set up in the 1960s, especially by the later part of the 1960s, there are options for people to sort of opt out of being drafted, depending on different categories of what are known as deferments. So obviously there are deferments and there are ways out of the draft for physical kinds of infirmities, right? This has been the case all the way back through even into the Second World War and the First World War, that if you were physically medically unable to enter combat, then you wouldn't be drafted. But in the 1960s, there are additional kinds of deferments that include things like, well, if you are a college student, you don't have to be drafted. If you are your family's only male son, right, if you are the person that would carry on the name for future generations with your children, you can be deferred from the draft. And oftentimes what this does then is it means that people in the middle and upper classes can find ways to avoid military service, where people in the lower classes, because they're not the ones able to afford going to college, oftentimes they're from larger families, etc., they get sort of unequally drafted, at least in terms of the percentage of the people serving in the military compared to the percentage of that particular population in the overall population of the country. It ends up being a gap. And so you start to see far more African Americans and Latinos and Hispanics serving in the armed forces than their percentage in the overall population would otherwise suggest. And this ends up partially becoming the focus of the civil rights movement by the 1967-68 era. I mentioned that a little bit in connection with Martin Luther King Jr.'s sort of changing approach in the years leading up to his death. There is also then a growing effort among a number of different groups within American society to sort of advance, I don't want to say alternate cultures, but certainly an effort to challenge the status quo. And you see this in a variety of different ways. For one, feminism. Feminism is an outgrowth of the suffrage movement from the early part of the 20th century. It is an effort, in this case, not to achieve the right to vote, because that had been accomplished in 1920, but this is an effort to expand opportunities and access and equality in other areas of society. Whether that is employment, whether that is in legal status, whether that is in opportunities and involvement in politics, any number of different things. There are different kinds of developments that help propel this wave of feminism into prominence, things like the inclusion of gender as a protected category in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the creation of the National Organization of Women in 1965. More and more women are being more and more outspoken, more and more vocal about the challenges that women in the United States face and some of the solutions that they see as being necessary in order to achieve that kind of equality. There's also then a reaction to mainstream culture that's known as the counterculture. The counterculture is a fairly kind of movement mainly because of its identification with hippies. That's not all the same thing. Certainly the hippies were part of the counterculture, but the counterculture is a broader kind of a thing that's expressed in a number of different ways. That's probably just the most stereotypical example. But they're rejecting middle-class mainstream culture, and they're doing it in the way that they dress. They're doing it in their understanding of like personal hygiene. They're doing it through music. They're doing it through drug use. Certainly the center of the counterculture in the United States was primarily San Francisco. But it was also something that started to appear in a variety of ways in the Midwest, in the East, in the South to some extent. And so it was definitely a widespread thing. But there were certainly attempts by the media industry, by the culture industry, to kind of co-opt the counterculture, to try to turn it into a moneymaker for them, whether this was in the music industry or the movie industry, whether this was in other areas of consumerism. But it is another example of a question of sort of the generation gap, right? Young people perceiving the world in a certain way, wanting to express that perception in a certain way, compared to what they understand as being sort of the dominant old white men kind of running things for their own interest. Things like this reappear pretty regularly in American history. It's not any different from conversations and sort of representations that we see in the 1990s or in the 2000s, 2010s, right? It's a fairly repeatable kind of development. One of the other major movements that comes out of the 1960s, especially the very late 1960s, is the movement for gay rights and equality. And in many ways, the modern gay rights movement gets kicked off at an event in New York City in summer of 1969. Basically what happens is there is a club in Lower Manhattan called the Stonewall Inn, and it gets raided by New York City police. In theory, it's raided because it is operating without a liquor license. That's kind of a fuzzy justification. Technically, it wasn't operating with a liquor license, but it had been operating in that way for quite some time. And this was part of a sort of a general sweep by New York police at the time against a number of different businesses and localities that sort of catered to the gay community. And it ends up leading to violence that stretch over a few days, where the gay community begins to sort of fight back, right, against this kind of discrimination and prejudice. And this becomes the sort of rallying cry then for a growing, more self-conscious, more open kind of gay rights movement that begins in New York but very quickly stretches into other cities around the country, where it involves demonstrations, marches, more public kinds of exhibitions or expressions of gay pride, advocating direct action in order to achieve equality and equal rights, as opposed to the kinds of more, I don't want to say secretive, but less overt kinds of efforts that had characterized efforts in the past. The Stonewall incident then becomes sort of the moment of transition in the gay rights movement. It becomes the focal point then for gay rights pride or gay pride parades that are recognizing the anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. You see the emergence then of organizations that are specifically designed to advocate for equality, whether that's legal equality, economic equality, the ending of discrimination in sort of social or community issues, that sort of thing. And so this is going to be another example of a community that during the 1960s begins to be more active, more overt, more open in its efforts to achieve equality and sort of tolerance among the broader population as well. Things then will really sort of reach a tipping point in 1968 in many ways. This is going to be a significant year in America's involvement in Vietnam. It's going to be a significant year in terms of American politics. It will be a significant year in terms of levels of violence and disruption that the country really hadn't seen in many ways since the Great Depression or even the Civil War. So in Vietnam, the year of 1968 sort of starts in January with a major Vietnamese offensive against the Americans in South Vietnam. These attacks are shown on American television. They're ultimately, from a military standpoint, unsuccessful. But the fact that they are happening after months and years of Americans being told, you know, well, we're winning the war. The phrase that was always used was, well, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. That the war is progressing in our favor. We are reaching a point where we're about to secure our objectives, etc., etc. And yet, in January of 1968, the Vietnamese and the Viet Cong managed to mount this massive undertaking where they are even so far as attacking the American embassy in Saigon, which is deep in South Vietnam, should be one of the most protected and secure places in the entire country. And yet, now all of a sudden, there are people attacking the American presence right in the heart of South Vietnam. Again, ultimately, the attacks fail, but the coverage ends up convincing many Americans that the war is not a winnable thing, that their morale is, their support for the war is pretty much obliterated. The idea of how credible the American government is and the military establishment is in terms of what they are telling the American people versus what appears to be the reality is very, very inconsistent, right? This is known as the credibility gap. And this puts a lot of pressure on Lyndon Johnson because 1968 is a presidential election year. Johnson constitutionally can run for president again if he wishes. As the year starts, he's planning to run for re-election, but as the year progresses, his failings in sort of solidifying the Great Society program, the growing consideration among lots of Americans that Johnson is personally mismanaging the war effort, and a growing number of challengers from within the Democratic Party, including Robert Kennedy, the recent president's brother, ends up presenting a significant challenge to Johnson's chances for re-election. And in the summer of 1968, then Johnson takes the almost unprecedented step of announcing to the American people that he won't seek re-election. This is pretty rare for a sitting president to have an opportunity to run again and openly declare that he will not run again. This then throws the election of 1968 pretty much wide open, right? At least from the standpoint of the Democratic Party. At the same time, there are high-profile assassinations that make Americans believe that the country is in some ways sort of coming apart at the seams. We talked about Reverend King's assassination in Memphis in April of 1968. This is a shock to many Americans. It is considered to be sort of for some people at the time, sort of the beginning of the end of the chances for the civil rights movement to achieve ongoing success, especially through peaceful means. In June of 1968, just a few months later, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. He is basically the same night that he has won the California primary for the Democratic Party, which solidifies him as the front runner in the Democratic race for the nomination. He's assassinated. This means that Hubert Humphrey, who was sort of the only other legitimate candidate at the time, is going to secure the Democratic nomination. Humphrey, though, is not the kind of magnetic or sort of galvanizing figure that Robert Kennedy would have been. I've said before that historians don't like playing the game of what if, because there's no way to know what might have happened because it depends on an infinite number of variables. But this is one of those what if moments. Had Kennedy not been assassinated, it seems pretty likely that he would have gotten the nomination. Whether he would have been able to defeat the Republican challenger, Richard Nixon, hard to say. Odds seem to be pretty good, but of course, you know, there's no way that we can know for certain. The instability then within American politics at the time. The Republicans settle on Nixon pretty easily. Nixon will go on, as we will see, he'll go on to win a fairly comfortable victory in 1968 over Humphrey. But the stress, the tension, the instability of American society and American politics in 1968 really comes to a head in Chicago at the Democratic Convention. So this is the meeting in which the Democratic Party is going to officially select the person that they want to run for president against Nixon. It ends up being a very violent, very brutal kind of affair in many ways. The streets of Chicago outside the hotel where the convention takes place end up being the scene of widespread demonstrations by anti-war protesters, by anti-Johnson protesters, by people who are just increasingly frustrated and disillusioned with the country as a whole. And this is met with a police response that is shown on national television and at times appears to kind of go over the line into the realm of police brutality. So the country in 1968 is as divided and confrontational as practically any time in its history, right? It is divided increasingly by generation. It's divided increasingly by socioeconomic status. It's divided increasingly by race. And these are all of the different kinds of things that are going to bear fruit in the 1970s, the 1980s, all the way down to the present in many respects. So that's it for this session. Our next session then will actually talk about the Nixon presidency, how the United States eventually gets out of Vietnam, and then what happens to the country in the 1970s, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, in the aftermath of some of the upheavals of the 1960s, and leading then directly to the Reagan presidency. So I hope you're all doing really well. Let me know if you've got questions. Our next session will probably be a little bit shorter, so you won't have to, listen to me drone on this way. But I will see everybody shortly.